So this morning, I'd like to talk about, in that song, the last line, Jeff provided that beautiful poster back there that he made. I don't know if any of you saw it on the way in. This is my Father's world. Jesus who died will be satisfied, and earth and heaven be one. And my question is, what does that mean? What does that mean? What is God's desire there for heaven and earth to be one? In Ephesians, in chapter 1, verse 9, it says, "And he made known to us the mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure, which he purposed in Christ to be put into effect when the times will reach their fulfillment, to bring all things in heaven and earth together under one head, even Christ." So the song didn't just come from the song. It's also in Scripture. It talks about God's desire to bring all things together under one head in Christ. Jesus also, it was a prayer that he gave in the Lord's Prayer. He said, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." That implies that sometimes God's will isn't always done on earth. We know that, but it is God's heart, and he asks us to pray that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So God has a desire to unite heaven and earth. I'd like to, one of the things I want to do is talk about, if he wants to unite heaven and earth, we need to know what heaven and earth are and what is the difference between heaven and earth. So I'm going to write up here heaven and I'll put earth down here. What is the difference? What are differences between heaven and earth? If we were to define heaven and define earth, what is the differences? It's obviously two entities because we have two words for two different things. So what is the difference between heaven and earth? Or what would you say to describe heaven, or what would you say to describe earth?
Earth, physical realm.
Okay. Earth is a physical. And so that implies that heaven is spiritual.
Heaven is everlasting and earth is temporal.
Okay. It's got the... Anything else?
Heaven has no sin and the earth is full of it.
Okay. Earth has sin and no sin. Any other ideas? Yes?
The world is full of sorrow, and there'll be no sorrow in heaven.
Okay. There's no sorrow,
No sickness,
sickness. And here there is sickness and sorrow. Okay? Anybody else? Yes?
Heaven will be full of worship.
Worship? Okay.
That could be both.
Okay. I'm going to say a few other differences that I have down here. Heaven is unseen. Earth is seen. And that also would relate to physical and spiritual. Heaven is God's habitat. And so earth would be man's or human's habitat. And we talked about God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. So in heaven, God has complete authority. Is that correct?
Yes.
So heaven, God has authority. While on earth, God gave, what did God say in Genesis? God gave man authority. So there are differences between heaven and earth. Heaven is the spiritual, earth is physical. Heaven, God has complete authority. On earth, God gave man authority. Now we also, heaven is unseen, earth is seen, and we also said here it's everlasting. No sin, no sorrow, no sickness, and there's worship there, and then also there's worship on earth. Sorrow, sickness, and it's temporal. Now I want to just suggest this, everything up here is right. But heaven and earth existed before sin, right? Was there still differences before sin between heaven and earth? Yes, there were still differences. So when God created heaven and earth, what did he say about it? When he created the earth, what did he say? It is good. So I don't think I have the eraser. So anyhow, when God created heaven and earth, there were still differences. So there was still the difference of unseen and seen, and also before sin, God gave man authority on earth. He created earth to be a habitat for people. Heaven was the habitat of God. So all that was different. But there wouldn't have been sin, sorrow, and sickness in heaven, nor would there have been sin, sorrow, or sickness on earth prior to sin. So the differences, if you think the differences between heaven and earth, do not necessarily include sorrow and sickness and those type of things. But they are definitely differences now. Do you know, and I didn't know this all the time, but do you know that oftentimes we think when God created the days that he said every day was good, but he didn't. There was one day he didn't say at the end of the day it was good. What?
He said it was very good.
Yeah, sometimes he says good, sometimes he says very good, but there was one day that he didn't say anything about it being good. And it's kind of interesting. The day that God created, I think it is the second day. It says he separated the waters from above to the waters below, or the firmament, or what that means is he separated the heaven from the earth, separated the sky. He created the physical representation of what we would call heaven, the skies, the heavens, and from the earth. That day, when God did that, in the second day, he says he separated the waters above from the waters below, or he separated the heavens from the earth. He did not say it was good. And I think there was a reason for that. That was a physical representation of what God wanted to do. And he did not say that it was good to separate the heavens from the earth. But on the second day, that was created. So, when he created a garden, right? He created, what else did he create? He created animals, and he created man, and he created plants. He created plants with a body, and he created animals with a body and a soul. Like animals have, I don't know about bugs, but animals in general have a mind. When they have, dogs like have emotions, they have a will, and they have they have mind, they have emotions, and they have a will. So they created animals with a body and soul, and he created humans with a soul, a body, and a spirit. Is that correct? It says in Thessalonians he created a spirit, soul, and body. And when he created man, how did he create man? In his own image. And what did he do? He took dirt and he formed it. Everything else he created, he spoke it. But when he created man, he formed it out of the dust of the dirt. And then he did something else. What did he do next? He breathed life into the man. He breathed his breath. God, who is spiritual, breathed into man who is physical, and life was created. So that's an important thing to remember, that physical plus spiritual equals life. Okay? Physical plus spiritual equals life. Spiritual plus physical equals life. So, when God breathed his life into man, he breathed his spirit into man, life formed in him, and he was a living spirit, soul and body. So also in the garden, what else was in the garden? Well, here we have Adam and Eve. Let's put Adam and Eve here. And so we had Adam and Eve in the garden. Yeah, we have the plants. We have the plants, the body. And we had the animals. And the presence of God. And we had the humans. We also had a river. There was a river in the garden, which had precious stones in it. And so God provided our water in the garden. He provided food. What did he provide for food?
Trees and plants.
What grew on the plants and trees. So he had trees in the garden. for food, and he had two trees specifically. What were the two trees?
Good and evil.
He had the tree of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he had the tree of life. And he said, what did he say? What did God say then about the trees?
One you should not
Right. He said you can eat of all the trees in the garden, but don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay? So, what happened then?
sin.
Yeah, sin. But Adam and Eve ate, which tree did they eat from?
Good and evil.
Yeah, so Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I was sharing this one time, and I asked what tree they ate for, and somebody said, the tree they could reach. Because I had the tree of life drawn higher. I draw the tree of life larger because in Revelations it talks about the tree of life being on both sides of the river, and it was filled with brown fruit. I think it was that way in the Garden of Eden too. I think the tree of life was huge, and it was filled with lots of good things. And the tree of knowledge of good and evil was probably this little shrub, ugly looking thing, I think. But anyhow, they chose to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then what happened then? Satan came as a serpent, and what did he say?
Surely you will not die.
Right.
Did God say?
Yeah, did God say,
If you eat of it, you will die.
if you eat of this tree, you will die?
Surely.
He says, surely you will not die. Was Satan lying?
Yes.
Yeah, he was lying to a certain degree. Adam and Eve did not die physically, but they did die. So when they ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he says, you will become like God, knowing. Was that true? No. To a certain extent, they did obtain knowledge of good and evil. All of a sudden they saw, their eyes were open. And all of a sudden they realized that, wait a minute, all of a sudden they started feeling like sin. Started feeling things were wrong. They started determining what was right and wrong. So when they sinned and ate from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, a veil, heaven and earth, separated. Is that right?
Yes.
There was a separation that occurred, or a veil that came between heaven and earth. And man's spirit died. He had no longer had access to God through his spirit. And it died. And so what did man do? He what? He hid. And he felt that there was a separation that occurred. There was something wrong. He felt naked. He felt shame. And so he hid from God, and he covered himself with fig leaves. He covered himself with fig leaves. That was man's first attempt at religion, at trying to make himself pure without God. He took and put fig leaves and wrapped himself in these fig leaves. He tried to make himself pure without God. And what did God say? God says, that's not going to work. He says, it's only me who can make you pure. It's only me. You cannot make yourself pure with your fig leaves.
Amen.
He said, he went and took an animal and killed it. They killed it, took the skins, and covered them. So God was saying, I can cover your shame. You can't cover your own shame with fig leaves, but I can cover your shame. I can make you righteous, and I can purify you, but you can't do that. But I'm willing to do that. So before he put them out of the garden, he covered them with skins as looking forward to when he would cover us with Jesus and his own sacrificial lamb for us. So God put them out of the garden. A veil was separating heaven and earth, and people were aware of this. They no longer had access to the tree of life because they would eat of that and live forever in their sin. So God put them out of the garden. They now became dependent. They didn't have the Spirit to guide them anymore because their access to God through their Spirit was dead. So what did they do? They started depending on their mind, their soul for guidance, their will, and their emotions. So people were running around depending on their intellect to be their guide, depending on their will, whatever felt good for the moment, that's what we do, or their emotions were guiding them. Is that not how humanity tends to live today? They're guided by their mind, their will, and their emotions. And because their access to God through the Spirit, that is not how God intended it to be. God did not intend on us to be determiners of good and evil. He was to be lead us through our Spirit in what was right and what was wrong. And we were to look to Him for guidance, look to Him to lead and direct us. And we were to be dependent. God is independent. God is autonomous. It's God who determines what is right and wrong. And we are to be dependent on Him and follow our guidance through the Spirit, through Him. And so we then started following our mind, will, and emotions, and Satan took advantage of that. And he is actually injecting into our mind, will, and emotions. It's his. Often, when we think we're living on our own, we're really leading by Satan's guidance.
Amen.
We think we're just being led by our mind and will and emotions, but we're being led by the evil one and his system. So now there is a veil that separates heaven and earth. And God said there would be a time when through woman a son would be born, an offspring of the woman that would solve this problem and destroy the serpent.
Amen.
But at this point, this is the situation that they were in. And mankind knew this. So they left the garden, and life started occurring. It started getting awfully bad to the point where God decided it was so much in a mess, he decided to destroy it through Noah and the flood. And then man continued on earth. And then man was aware of this separation between heaven and earth. And so they decided to build something. A tower. Does anybody know, you can get ready for the PowerPoint. Does anybody know what a ziggurat is? Not a cigarette, but a ziggurat. This is a ziggurat. People built ziggurats, which were, this is over in Ur, right now, and it is they found names for ziggurats that they've discovered on the earth. And I'll just read you some of the names. It's very interesting. The ziggurat they found at Larsa, they found the name to be called the House of the Link Between Heaven and Earth. they found another one in Borsippa to be the house of the seven guides of heaven and earth. So they found these names. They found, in Babylon, they found one that was called the house of the foundation of the platform of heaven and earth. So they were very aware of this separation. So they thought if they built a stairway to heaven, their idea was, this is the one in Ur, which is in Babylon area. An artist did a reconstruction of what it would have looked like complete before there was damage for over the years. But they would build a house at the top of the ziggurat. And then they would build a stairway. And then at the bottom, they would put a sacrifice of some sort. And the idea was that God was up there in heaven, we're here on earth, there's a separation, but we're going to build easy access for God to connect with us. So they started building this tower, and on top of it was where the house where God was supposed to come in, and then he was able to come down to them, and they would offer their sacrifices and appease him. That was the idea. Do you know of a ziggurat in the Bible? The Tower of Babel was a ziggurat. Scholars are pretty much unanimous that the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat. Man decided that they were going to build this huge tower, humanism, through their own strengths, build this huge tower and build a city around it. We were going to become knowledgeable, and we're going to build this huge tower that connects us to God to get his favor. And so they started building. Here they were. Oops, they ran into something. They ran into a veil when they were building. So they were building this tower, and for God to come down, and God did come down, but he wasn't happy. What did he do that time? He said, this should not be. He destroyed their language. He made their languages different and separated them and said, I do not approve of man's attempts to make himself holy and make himself righteous and get through the veil. Man can never do that. There's only one who can do that for you. And so he went and ended this construction by destroying their language, and then man scattered over the face of the earth. But God was not opposed to ziggurats. He was opposed to that ziggurat, but he was not opposed to ziggurats. There is another ziggurat in the Bible. Does anybody know? After the Tower of Babel, and it's in Genesis. There was a man who had a dream. And what did he see? He saw a staircase. Jacob left Beersheba, and he set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head, and he lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with his top reaching to heaven. And the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And there above it stood the Lord. Okay, now, where did he see the Lord? Above it. And what was Jacob familiar with? Jacob would have been familiar with ziggurats. So he saw the Lord in his house. Above it stood the Lord. He said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go. So, the same thing, he said he's going to spread his offspring throughout the earth. In the Tower of Babel, the people were spread throughout the earth. But God's ziggurat, the people is also going to be spread throughout the earth. I'm with you and watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So God was not opposed to ziggurats. He was opposed to humanism and man's attempt of religion to try to solve his problems. But God says, I solve your problem. I can create a ziggurat that does connect heaven and earth. Jacob's ladder did not stop at the veil. Jacob's stairway that he saw went right up through to heaven. And he saw the Lord at the top and the stairway. And so, oops, wrong way. When Jacob woke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. God came to Jacob in the experience that he was aware of. This was what he was aware of ziggurats, and he knew it, and God came to him this way. And God said, I do approve of ziggurats, just not man's attempts. And so, and what did he call it? The house of God, Bethel. He named the place Bethel, which Beth is house, and El is God in Hebrew. So it means the house of God. And then he said, and early next morning, Jacob took the stone he had under his head, he set it up as a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. So he did what he was familiar with. At the bottom of the stairway, you make a sacrifice to God. He took the stone he was laying his head on, he put it on end and poured oil on it. Oil represents spiritual in the Bible, right? And the rock represents physical. Spiritual plus physical equals life. That was the first living stone in God's house. The house of God is built of living stones. And that was the first living stone in God's house. And that was very familiar with what they would have did and made a sacrifice at the bottom of the stairway to God. So then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that you set up as a pillar will be God's house. The living stone became God's house. Oil, physical and spiritual connected becomes God's house. And all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. So I want you to remember now that where this stairway went the whole way, connected heaven and earth, where heaven and earth united, it is called the house of God. So whenever you see the house of God, think physical plus spiritual uniting. Okay? When we'll look at it throughout the Bible, when we see the house of God, it's where heaven and earth connect, where heaven and earth unites, and where the physical and spiritual unite, and it's where life is brought forth at. I was down in Tikal in the Mayan jungles of Guatemala, and they had built ziggurats there as well. In about 1,000, that was about 1,000 AD. Now those other ziggurats were probably more like 3,000 or 4,000 BC. but they also built them. So man has this awareness that here, 3,000 years later, in another part of the world, they build the exact same thing. So humanity has this awareness that they're separated from heaven, from God. And they're trying to make a connection. They did the exact same thing 1,000 years later. Here they built, you see the house on top, the stairway, and you see the sacrificial stone at the bottom of the stairway, set on end. It's over here. Go ahead. This is John 1, 47 to 51. Jesus was speaking. If somebody would like to read that.
Sure. Yeah.
It's on the screen.
On the screen, yeah. You can just...
As they approached, Jesus said, "Now here is a genuine son of Israel, a man of complete integrity. How do you know about me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus replied, "I could see you under the fig tree before Philip found you." Then Nathanael exclaimed, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel." Jesus asked him, "Do you believe this just because I told you I had seen you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than this." Then he said, "I tell you the truth, you will all see heaven open and the angels of God going up and down on the Son of Man, the one who is the stairway between heaven and earth."
So isn't that interesting? Jesus, when he was calling his disciples, he said to Nathanael, "Now here is a genuine son of Israel, a man of complete integrity." The interesting thing is, the actual word is, here is a son of Israel, a man in whom there is no deceit. Jacob was known as the deceiver. So Jesus was thinking, when he was speaking this, he goes, here's Nathanael, a man who has no deceit. He knew Jacob was known as the deceiver, so that whole concept of the stairway was there. And then he says, that stairway that Jacob saw, that was me. I'm that stairway that connects heaven and earth. I am the house of God. I am the physical and spiritual connected. I am that stairway. And he says, you'll see greater things. Then you'll see the Son of Man, you'll see the angels of God going up and down on the Son of Man, the one who is the stairway between heaven and earth. So, jumping back to Genesis and Jacob's ladder, that was the first time house of God is mentioned in the Bible. When was the next house of God? Does anybody know the next house of God that comes along in the Bible? You can guess. Doesn't matter. And what was the house of God? The tabernacle. That's the next house of God that comes along in the Bible. The tabernacle. So, oops, wrong way. So in the wilderness, in 1 Corinthians 10, 1-4, you want to pass that mic, somebody else can read that?
Anybody like to?
For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and that they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ.
So just like in the garden, God provided spiritual food in the river, spiritual water in the river and drink and food with the trees. In the desert, God provided spiritual food and spiritual drink. And in the New Testament, it says the rock that they drank from, do you remember when Moses struck the rock? He says that rock that they drank from, that was Christ. That was Christ, that water they drank. And later on, when Moses was angry, he struck the rock again, but that's not what God told him. God told him to speak to the rock, because Christ was only crucified once, and he paid all the price through one death. And so the second time Moses was asked to speak to the rock, and the Lord Jesus would provide, because he's our provider. He would provide them water. And that was the cause of why Moses couldn't go into the promised land. Moses, who was a lawgiver, could not take them to the promised land. Only Yeshua could. And Yeshua is the Hebrew name for Joshua and also Jesus. And so it took Jesus to take the people to the promised land. And Moses, when Moses asked to see God, how was Moses allowed to see God? God took Moses and he put him in a broken rock, a clefted rock, which is one rock that is clefted. Have you ever see a rock when you're out hiking or something? And you see that rock was one rock at one time and it broke in half. That's what a clefted rock is. And so when Moses wanted to see God, he put him in a clefted rock, and then he could see God. Why? Because the rock is Christ, and it's only in Christ that we can be. And the rock was broken so that we could be put inside of Christ and see God. And that was what would happen for Moses. That's why God put him in a clefted rock and then passed over him and left him see himself. So they were in the desert, and God wanted to reveal himself to all of them. So he said he was going to come to Mount Sinai, and he was going to speak to all the people. And what did the people say? No, we don't want to speak to you. See, God's heart is for us to connect. God's heart is for relationship, for heaven and earth to be united. But it was people there who said, wait a minute, this is too much for us to handle. He said, speak to us through Moses. Give us a priest. So the people rejected God as their priest and said, we want a human in between. And so God gave him the priesthood, and then God gave him the law, and they had the the tabernacle. And this is a artist's reconstruction. The tabernacle is pretty well described in the Bible, and they pretty much know exactly, even down to the measurements of what it was like. If you can make it through reading all that without getting losing. But some people do, and they figure it all out. And this is what it would have looked like. And there's actually one over in Lancaster that you can actually go see, which is a reproduction, which is very interesting. It's along 30. So there you see what it would have looked like. And here you have the tabernacle. That's the wall around it, like you saw the fence. They had a bronze altar for sacrifices. Then they had a laver, which was like a round basin with water in it. And then you entered the building, and it had that was called the Holy of Holies, and it had the table of showbread. They had the altar of incense and a golden candlestick. And then they had, what's in between there? A veil. Have we seen a veil before? There was a veil. And then there was the Holy of Holies. In the Holy of Holies was a room 15 by 15. It was a cubic room. 15 by 15 by 15 feet. And what was in that room? The Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was 2.5 feet by 3.5 feet. And it was wood that was covered with gold. And what does wood represent? Humanity and physical. And what does gold represent? Divinity. So in the Ark of the Covenant, they took gold and wood, put it together, and that's where God resided. Now, I got this off the internet. This is a construction of the, I don't know if it was this fancy or not, but it was made pretty fancy here. But it was a gold box, and it had 2 cherubim on it, and God's presence, and the top was a lid. It was a mercy seat, and that was all solid gold, beaten out of one piece. And God's presence actually wasn't in the box, but it was between the cherubim. And in the box was, does anybody see, there are 3 things that they had put in the box in the Ark of the Covenant. The law, Aaron's rod that budded, and the manna. Yeah. He put the manna in, the Aaron's rod that budded, and the law. The law was Jesus was the fulfillment of the law. He was the bread of life, and he was the anointed one. He was the anointed one, the bread of life, and the law, and the fulfillment of the law. God was willing to reside in a tent. He didn't need a palace. He didn't need a temple. He was willing to reside in a tent. And he's also willing to reside in our tent. And that's why God chose to live in a simple tent. Because it was a foreshadowing of his willingness to live in a simple tent of us. And the tabernacle was divided into 3 places: spirit, the Holy of Holies, the spiritual; the soul, the holy place; and the body. On the holy place had an altar of incense. And I think that symbolizes the obedience of our will. Is a beautiful incense to God. It had a candlestick, revelation, the revelation of our mind. It had the table of showbread, which relates to our emotions. God is involved in communing with us. It affects our emotions. It had a laver, our body. In Romans 12 it says, sacrifice your body is a living, sacrifice your bodies as a living sacrifice. Our bodies are in the brain order, we sacrifice them as a living sacrifice to God. The laver is a symbol of the washing of our bodies, making us pure through baptism. The Holy of Holies represents our soul, and the holy place represents our soul, and the Holy of Holies represents our spirit with God indwelling it. Our spirit with God indwelling it. And he called that the house of God. Because this is the place where the Israelites saw their connection with God. This is a place where spiritual and physical connected, and the place that this would have been the veil. Although the veil is still there, this would have been the place where physical and spiritual connected. So God was foreshadowing the house of God being us. We're going to be having communion and having lunch, and then after lunch I'll be speaking again on other houses of God. We're talking about Jesus as the house of God and us as the house of God. And so I think we'll break it. As we take communion, you can reflect on God being our source, Jesus being our source, Jesus being our bread, Jesus being our payment. He's being the one who can make heaven and earth united as one.